Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I am going to look at Elizabeth I's early foreign policy. So I'm looking at 1558 to 1568. So we're just going to kind of get the first part of it. We're going to start looking at some problems in relationship with Spain, look at relationship with Scotland, the relationship with France, and we're going to look at that big question of marriage, and we've got a bit of Mary Queen of Scots in here as well. So all really good, interesting stuff, and we've got some stuff that could help the kind of questions you could get on foreign policy. Also looking at some issues like pro-Protestant foreign policy and the kind of decisions that Elizabeth and her council are making. So the key question on the spec is how did foreign relations change during Elizabeth's reign, and how was succession secured? And we've got a lot of different parts that feed into that, as I've said, and we're going to look at relations with different countries and how they change. And this issue of succession is really important because it links in with the idea of marriage, and also it links into this other key figure, Mary Queen of Scots. So in the early years of her reign, Elizabeth faced a number of challenges, but she also had a fairly major card that she could play, and this could have had a really big impact if she played it, but also quite a big impact by her not playing it. And that tells me what she chooses to do. This trump card is marriage. Now, she could have used it to secure a significant alliance. By not playing it, actually, she makes, particularly in the late 1550s and through the 1560s, she makes both France and Spain slightly wary. In case, I mean, if one side takes against her, then she is likely to ally with the other, and therefore this causes possibly Elizabeth and England to get away with more than they otherwise would have done, because Elizabeth obviously is a very attractive prize as a potential bride for any member of a European royal family. But England is comparatively weak, and again we have to bear this in mind if we're judging success of foreign policy and the moves that Elizabeth makes, because we can't expect too much. The two great nations are France and Spain, and Elizabeth has inherited a crown that is far from rich. So those two nations are the significant ones that Elizabeth has to worry about. Religion is also going to be a hugely important issue. Obviously, England is very isolated as a Protestant nation, whilst most of Europe is Catholic, and the chances of a Catholic action, united Catholic action against England, is always a possibility. Now, when we get into later foreign policy, once you get to 1570 and Elizabeth gets excommunicated and we get further down that line, then obviously that becomes a bigger issue. But even before that, there is still this chance of a united Catholic action against Elizabeth, or one of the Catholic monarchs using that as a good reason to attack. So we're going to look at securing the succession, and the main way this could have been done at this point was through marriage. So Elizabeth is very much of marriageable age through this time period that we're looking at, and there is no shortage of suitors. The first one that appears is Philip II. Now, the marriage between Mary, Elizabeth's sister, to Philip, had given England the security of a powerful ally. The Wyatt's rebellion highlighted that not all Englishmen were happy with this arrangement, and a part of this is to do with the ideas of marriage at this point in time, where the idea was that the wife would obey her husband, the husband would be dominant, and therefore if your nation's ruler is a queen and another nation's ruler is her husband and is a king of somewhere else, then there is a worry that your nation will become subservient to that nation at this point in time. There had been Mary that had a kind of a watertight marriage treaty that meant that Philip had no claim on the English throne, didn't really have any direct power in England when Mary was alive either. And we see right from the beginning in 1558, we see the Spanish ambassador meeting with Elizabeth, trying to negotiate a marriage alliance. Philip offered his hand in marriage. Can be seen as a gesture and a genuine offer. Again, the slightly differing opinions on this. I mean, you would think these two families might have learnt a bit from what happened last time when there'd been a marriage alliance with one sibling. That sibling had died and they'd married another, because obviously we can trace that back to what happens with Henry and Catherine of Aragon. So you would have thought maybe going down that same route again with a second marriage would maybe not be a great idea. There was a significant difference, obviously, because Philip is very committedly Catholic and Elizabeth is Protestant. It was unpopular with a lot of English people and a lot of people at the court, because there'd been the recent war. Spain had not been a great ally, and England got involved with the war with France on Spain's behalf, and ended up losing control of Calais, which was a kind of very treasured possession of the English. Now, Elizabeth turned down the marriage immediately. Obviously, Philip had been married to her sister, as already mentioned, and there's a lot to suggest that he hadn't treated Mary particularly well. And obviously, as again previously mentioned, that their marriage had led to a rebellion. So Philip is suitor number one, and again, there's a lot of positives you could say by potential marriage to Philip. Spain is just about the most powerful nation you could marry into. The Habsburgs, the most powerful family, but more negatives in there, and Elizabeth decides it's not the right thing to go for. Now there is a potential marriage where there isn't a religion issue, which is Prince Eric of Sweden, who is Protestant. Now he had some documented mental instability, which rather put Elizabeth off. Many of the councils, such as Cecil, were actually quite keen on this marriage, about creating a Protestant alliance, which again, this idea of a pro-Protestant foreign policy. And what was that underlying it? Well, seems to be an idea that many of the council, particularly Cecil and then later likes of Walsingham, kind of really want to push, but Elizabeth maybe slightly less keen. Eric obviously was very keen on the marriage. England was a lot more powerful than Sweden. Again, it's hard to see really what this would offer Elizabeth, however, and what this would offer England. Sweden, not going to be that great a help if England is turned on by France or Spain. And so this idea comes to nothing. Now, at the end of the 1550s, 1559, Robert Dudley began to monopolise Elizabeth's attention. There was lots of rumours about what was going on. He seemed to have incredible access to her. She seemed to give all the outward appearance of a woman in love. There was a slight issue with all of this, of course, in that Robert Dudley was married to Amy Robsart. However, in 1560, she mysteriously fell down the stairs when all the servants were out at a fair. It was an enormous scandal. There was an investigation into it. Dudley was found to have done nothing wrong. Having said all this, this does mean that Dudley would be free to marry the Queen, because he's no longer married. But this would have caused an enormous scandal. There was people were already saying that Dudley had his wife killed to make way to the Queen's bed. It probably is just a tragic accident. I very much think Dudley would have very happily married Elizabeth. I don't think it would have been a great move on Elizabeth's behalf. It would have caused a huge kind of split in the court. There were pro and anti-Dudley factions at court, lots of strutting around wearing different coloured ribbons and all kinds of different things, but it really would have caused a major split if Elizabeth had married Dudley. In 62, she contracted smallpox, and often referred to as the crisis of 62, and this really showed the importance of a marriage. Dudley, who had been banished from court, kind of comes back into favour with a huge bang here, where it's named that he would be Lord Protector if Elizabeth were to die, and again is causing tensions at court. Elizabeth has no heir, and so there is pressure that she should marry. We've got Charles of Austria, and there's some again related to Philip. There's some enthusiasm for this marriage, but there are religious concerns. Elizabeth seems to encourage the proposal, but this might have been, as I've said earlier, that marriage is actually quite an effective tool for her in terms of foreign policy. That it's quite a good way of diffusing tensions with other European nations if it looks like she might potentially get married. It is said that Charles desperately did not want to move to England and therefore was not particularly keen on the marriage himself, and that it was all Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor's idea. And again, it comes to nothing. Elizabeth becomes increasingly frustrated with Parliament's and her council's determination to marry her off, and Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and the Earl of Pembroke are both kind of banished from the presence chamber in 1566 after they've talked about marriage. Marriage has been talked about in Parliament, and it's becoming really a very touchy subject for Elizabeth. But whilst it's not settled, it is a potential problem. One of the reasons why it is such a major problem is Mary, Queen of Scots. Now, Mary was Elizabeth's cousin and her closest living blood relative. The fact that Elizabeth herself had no heir, she wasn't married, therefore there was no immediate prospect of an heir, made her even more significant. The fact that she was Catholic made her dangerous. In 1561, as a teenager, Mary returned to Scotland from France, where she'd lived since she was about 5. She'd married the Dauphin Francis, who would become King of France fairly briefly. But he died, and with the changing factions of the French in the French court and with the French monarchy, then she's sent back to Scotland. Now, there was the Treaty of Edinburgh, and this left Scotland in the influence of Protestantism, which is good news for Elizabeth, less so for Mary, who's unable to exert all the authority she would like, and because the lairds of Scotland are Protestant, and so there is that tension there. One of the things that stirred, we believe, Elizabeth's ideas of marriage, and that we saw was issues in 1566, was that in 1565 Mary had married Lord Darnley, who was the great-grandson of Henry VII. She became pregnant. There was rumours, we think without any grounds, that she was having an affair with David Riso, her Italian secretary. Riso then was murdered in 1566 by Darnley. And it is even said that, having stabbed Riso in a kind of fury, that he threatened Mary's pregnant belly with a knife, and therefore, unsurprisingly, they become estranged. Now Mary gave birth to James, who would become James VI of Scotland, James I of England, in 1566. So not only is Mary a close blood relative, then James has got a very good blood claim as well, and so Mary, a potential monarch with a child, and this again deepens the kind of pressure on Elizabeth. Now, there's one thing that kind of almost lessens to an extent the problem of Mary is this huge scandal in 1567. Darnley's house explodes. There had been talk that him and Mary was going to no longer be estranged, that things were improving, but then his house explodes. Now he's found dead, not as you would expect, blown to pieces by the explosion, but found naked, strangled in a tree. The key the key suspect in all this is the Earl of Bothwell, and he was implicated in Darnley's murder. We've gone through a whole variety of stuff. Mary ends up marrying him. Her degree of choice is unclear on here. There are claims of rape. I believe she was pregnant with his child. There's then a series of kind of clashes between Mary's forces and the forces of the Protestant lords that Mary and Bothwell lose, and she's forced to abdicate in July 1567. James becomes James VI of Scotland, though he is still a baby at this point, and the Protestant Earl of Murray becomes regent. And Mary flees to England. Now we have the casket level letters which kind of implicate Mary in Darnley's death. So Mary is kept as a prisoner. Her presence, her religion, her connection to France the fact that she has a son. All of these things are causes for concern for Elizabeth. And Mary goes on to become the focus of Catholics' plots and international intrigue, including from Spain, seeing her as a possible alternative queen. Now, how serious Philip possibly felt about Mary, and there is even an argument that Mary's presence almost puts Philip off, because obviously if there was then a Catholic uprising or a Catholic plot and overthrew Elizabeth, then it would be Mary who would be the key candidate to take over, and it's unlikely that Philip's going to be wanting to remove Elizabeth simply to replace her with Mary, and particularly because of Mary's connections to France. So Mary is a really, really important figure in this period, and she's going to be even more important when we look at later foreign policy, and we look at the bit after 68, because in 69 we're going to see the Northern Rebellion, in 1570 we're going to see the excommunication, and then we're going to see the Ridolfi and the Parry and the Babington plots. So Mary being in England is going to be a big source of problems. It's not come to a head at this point by the time we get to 1568. So foreign policy with these different countries. Well, we've touched on a lot of the stuff with Scotland already. So Francis II had become King of France, aged only 15. Mary of Guise, who was the widow of James V and mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the Scottish regent. At this point, there's a Protestant revolt in Scotland. The French are sending forces to defend the Guise faction and Mary's control over Scotland. Cecil is again very keen on this idea of a pro-Protestant foreign policy, and he's persuading the Privy Council to send aid to the Scottish Protestants. The Treaty of Berwick in 1560 results in 8,000 English troops being sent to Scotland, again to shore up the Protestant lords. Then later that year we see the Treaty of Edinburgh. All English and French troops are removed from Scotland. Mary, Queen of Scots, recognises that Elizabeth is Queen of England. There's freedom of worship permitted in Scotland, so Catholics and Protestants can practice their religion. And this is seen as a success for Cecil, who's masterminded this kind of intervention. And you can say this is a success because Scotland is not a threat, and it obviously is the only country with a land border with England, and so this is a big deal. But all of it makes Elizabeth fairly wary of supporting foreign Protestants after this. We see that she does, but she never kind of goes in wholeheartedly. Francis in this time has died. He's been replaced by Charles IX, who's only 10, and therefore his mother, Catherine de' Medici, is in charge in France, and that's why we see the bit with Mary, Queen of Scots, kicking in and her coming back to Scotland, but having to accept the power of the Protestant lords. So with France, we've had the talk of the Old Alliance, and we can see that with the marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots. So France is always a potential problem, potential enemy for England. The Treaty of Cateau-Cambrai had ended the Habsburg-Valois Wars, which had begun back in 1515. And this is kind of concreting down the fact that France keeps Calais for at least 8 years. But would have to pay England a huge amount of money if at the end of that 500,000 crowns in compensation if they didn't then hand it back. But this is proceed on the idea of English good behaviour, and we'll soon see we don't necessarily get that. There's a huge factional issues in France, and then there's the French wars of religion, and we've got French Protestants who are referred to as Huguenots who are fighting against the Catholics. Again, we see sign of pro-Protestant foreign policy, where Elizabeth is agreeing to kind of reluctantly help the Huguenots. The Treaty of Richmond sees a loan of 140,000 crowns to the Huguenot leaders, and 3,000 troops sent to Le Havre under the command of the Earl of Warwick, who was Dudley's brother. In return, the Huguenots promised England the return of Calais, but obviously that was based on the idea that the Huguenots would win, which ultimately it doesn't work that way. The Catholics and the Huguenots decide that they dislike the English more than they dislike each other, and so they turn on the English, and the English troops are expelled from Le Havre. The Treaty of Troyes is then carried out in 64, and this ended English involvement in the wars of religion. So again, getting involved in another country's internal conflict is maybe not the greatest idea. And England loses the right for Calais, for which they get 120,000 crowns, which you can see is less than the loan that was given to the Huguenots. And so this pro-Protestant policy seems to have failed. And possibly because Elizabeth never fully committed to it, possibly just a sign of England's comparative weakness, that England isn't a strong enough power where it can be a deciding factor in the internal struggles in France. So England has avoided full-out war at this point, but the loss of Calais has been confirmed, and the machinations and the involvements with the Huguenots is again making Elizabeth enemies. Spain is going to be obviously the big one, the most important in terms of foreign relations. We've seen already the attempt of Philip to marry Elizabeth in 1559. Philip rules both Spain and the Netherlands, and this land is really, really important. The Netherlands is the most important trading partner for English, particularly for the England's main export, which is wool and cloth. And Philip's having a problem with the Netherlands because the Protestant ideas are spreading there, and obviously he's looking to impose Catholicism. And he's concerned about Elizabeth because obviously England has lots of connections in the Netherlands with the coasts and all the trade, and he's seen her supporting the Huguenots in France. And he kind of protests to her about this support for the Huguenots. Elizabeth is then having to keep her troops away from the Huguenot army in France. And again, this is part of the reason why the pro-Protestant foreign policy doesn't fully work. And this tension then reaches a head, and it costs England quite dearly, because Philip's government ends up banning imports of English cloth, and this is the biggest kind of earner in terms of English exports. Elizabeth retaliates by banning all imports from the Netherlands. This does all eventually break down due to the size of the financial costs that it's bringing. So again, it's short-lived, and I'm not sure how well England would have survived if that had stayed in place for a long time, and again showing the potential dangers of a pro-Protestant foreign policy. Problems in the Netherlands then continued for Philip. We get the Dutch Civil War in 1566, and Philip sends 10,000 troops under the Duke of Alba to restore order. Now, having that number of Spanish troops not far off the English coast is a significant worry for Elizabeth. In 1568, there's what proved to be a great controversy, and whether this is a great piece of luck or not, I'm not 100% certain. But there are a group of Spanish ships which are forced to seek shelter in England. They have 400,000 florins destined to pay the Duke of Alba and his army on them. Elizabeth decides to impound that money, and she kind of goes, well, and it's coming from an Italian bank, and Elizabeth accepts this as a loan to her rather than it going to pay the troops. And obviously this is going to have a fairly significant impact on Alba and his army. If you've got a load of soldiers and they're expecting to get paid and the money doesn't turn up, it's going to cause issues. Alba responded by confiscating all English ships that were in dock in the Netherlands. And Elizabeth therefore responded again by banning all trade with the Netherlands and Spain, and trade is not fully restored again until 1573. So we're going to have 5 years here of essentially a trade embargo, trade war, and again that's going to have financially damaging impact on England. There's further annoyance going on because John Hawkins has been disrupting Spain's trade monopoly in the Caribbean. He blockaded a load of Spanish ships in the Mexican port of San Juan de Ula. Only 2 ships escaped, and again tensions continue to rise. So again, we can maybe see why things like potential marriage negotiations are a potentially good idea at this point. But Spain and England are getting on to a really bad stage in terms of relations. Philip expelled the Spanish ambassador from Madrid. He replaced the Spanish ambassador in England with Despers, who's a kind of really hardline Catholic, and he immediately starts making contact with Mary, Queen of Scots. So at the point in 1568, Elizabeth's foreign policy is not looking to be in a great shape. Relations with Spain are really, really poor. On the other side, what's happened in Scotland means that they haven't really got the worry from the Scottish border. France, although relations haven't been great, France has got so much of its own problems with the religious wars, which Elizabeth has done a bit to stoke and keep going. So maybe both Scotland and France, maybe not a huge threat, but Spain most certainly is. And in being Protestant, Elizabeth is very much isolated from the rest of the monarchies in Europe. So I hope that's been helpful for you. If it has been, please hit the like. If you have any comments or questions, then please leave those below. Always welcome further questions and thoughts from people. And if you haven't done already, then please subscribe. This video is part of our series on Tudor history. There are also playlists on other aspects of British history, including modern Britain. There's a playlist on Tsarist and Communist Russia. There are some bits on American history, and there's also a lot of stuff here on A-level politics. So if you're enjoying this series of videos or any of them, then please subscribe and support the channel as we continue to help it grow. Thank you very much for watching.